Welcome to Peterson Academy DiaLogos. Today we have Leah. She will be offering a proposal on narcissism in religion and so spiritual and religious narcissism, particularly in leadership positions. I myself will be one of her listeners alongside Chris Graham. This is going to be a very interesting discussion, and it's going to be a hot take. It's going to be we might get into some controversial weeds here. So hang tight, listen, and enjoy the ride. All right, take it away, Leah.
Okay, I'm going to start with a story because I really liked the way you did that last time I listened to your stuff. So I'm going to start with a biblical story where the brothers of Joseph, they threw him into a pit, and they were angry. We were taking, you and I both took the status, the psychology of social status and stuff. And Joseph had told his brothers and his parents about this dream that he had, and they were already a little bit jealous of him and stuff. And his dream said, "You're going to bow down to me." And so that wasn't a good thing to tell his brothers. So, um, I was just thinking about how they had no problem. Not only did they throw him into a pit, and actually Reuben, the one of the brothers, tried to save his life, and he's like, "Well, we shouldn't kill him because let's just throw him in a pit." And you know, well, and he was trying to figure out something else to do with him, so so that they wouldn't kill him. But he didn't get it figured out, and then Judah, he's like, "Well, we should just sell him and sell him to another country," which ended up being Egypt. And we're going to we'll get money for him, and we won't have his blood on our hands. So these brothers, they thought that was a great idea. And it's like, okay, and these were God's people. And if you fast forward, that it uh, Jacob never recovered from, he had made a coat of many colors for Joseph, and they dipped it in blood and told him that, oh, let him jump to the conclusion, which it kind of seems like maybe he knew that his sons had done something, because he was like, he just didn't recover from this loss that he had. And um, and then Judah kind of got away from his brothers after this, and because they were pretty bad. And so and that's the line that Christ came through, was the line through Judah. And and all he really did was, sell his brother instead of kill him, which it's really interesting to me that, God puts up with it. He puts up with these psychopaths and narcissists, and he doesn't wipe everybody out. And this is the 12 tribes of Israel that, the people were that God's people came from. And so I thought that was interesting. And a story that kind of, in my life, I've searched for a church for the past 5 years. We had some bad leadership. We had a pastor. We had one youth pastor that went to prison for being a pedophile or whatever. He was having a relationship with a member of his, a person that was younger than him. And so he had moved and gone to a different church when this happened, but he was our youth pastor at one point. And it was really interesting because that was one situation, and the leaders of the church that I was going to, they really hid that from people and stuff too. And it was almost like I mean, I felt like they hid it, and it was almost like, they didn't want to know anything that might have happened. And so it was bizarre. And but that happened later. That was something that developed much later after we had a pastor that he the the police came to our church, and they opened up the books to try to get this pastor, and they couldn't find anything on him. And I know that they had the elders didn't correct anything, and there had been a lot of people that had come to the elders, but they just let them get away with everything, so there wasn't anything that they could do.
Hmm.
And so you have to set a standard. You have to put um, how are you going to handle things in place before you you do this, before you reprimand somebody or anything like that. You can't just have it be like okay at one point and then not okay. So they couldn't get anything on the books, uh, in the books about that he had done wrong. But I had it verified that from each elder that the police did come to them with information that he wasn't morally doing things that were, but they didn't say a word to the congregation or anything. And I thought that it was gonna be okay, and it just went on and on, and I thought that the reason why they weren't doing anything because he was still being investigated, but it ended up not being that way. And he left on his own because I think he got spooked, and it was like, and he just went on to another gig. So
Another church?
um no,
Oh, okay.
no, not another church. So, but those are things that, I don't even know if I should be even talking about it, because it's like it's in the past and stuff, but that's what really happened. And so, I stayed with the church, and it just didn't seem to get any better with, the leadership and stuff. So, they still made decisions that I didn't agree with. So, I left the church, and it was 5 years that I looked for another church. And so I went to all these different churches, and, it was, I didn't find a place that felt like that they wanted to follow Christ, like, seriously.
Hmm.
There was a lot of things that, the ideology of today was there.
Hmm.
And so then the next so I did find a church finally, but they're they're affiliated with the church that I left. And also, it seems like this church got picked. He picked them to do something in our town. And so that's my dilemma. It's like, okay, so, you know,
This is the narcissist. This is what we would call the narcissist from the other church is now in this new church.
well, they're a sister church,
Okay, yeah.
and they have started a school that's probably gonna, you know, end up being an autistic school, Christian school
Mm.
and stuff. So,
Is
and
this the pedophile pastor or the other pastor who you couldn't find anything on the books about
they're
him?
gone.
Oh, those are both gone.
They're both gone. But the leadership is partially still there. There's,
Oh, So the structure that allowed narcissism to kind of and
Yeah.
psychopaths to kind of slither in. Okay.
Yes. But, it's like, what do you do? Because this is something that, what do you do? It's, if God wants it, then, who am I to say, that
Does God want it though? Is that a correct assumption to have that God actually wants that, or um
well, I'm going back to because I go back and forth and I'm thinking about the different narcissists and psychopaths in the Bible. And, so it's like that's my dilemma, and that's what I need help thinking out. It's like,
okay.
you know, um, you know, does God allow for that? I mean, we have a lot of you I have not read Carl Jung yet, but
Mhm.
there's this thing with integration and all that stuff that I need to read it. But it's is it about God taking our failings and our personality disorders and doing something with them? I mean, if you look at the first church, and if there were if you were being persecuted like the first church was, I think that you would want somebody that had a low fear and um they the traits that a narcissist or a psychopath has, that if they were able to give that over to God and let him lead them. And so is it a brain thing, or what is it that makes somebody not have a lot of empathy or not have any empathy? And can you be obedient if you don't have empathy? Can you have mercy? Because God says, I want mercy. And I do think about the other thing I think about is the Pharisee, not the Pharisee, the Pharaoh, and how God had hardened his heart. And what does that mean? Because I think there comes a time when, if you don't burn out new neural pathways, and if it's something that if you don't burn those out and you know bring things up into your prefrontal cortex where you're thinking relationally, and you know if you're in enemy mode,
Hmm.
then and then I don't think that, if after so much time, I don't think you can think right. So is that what it means by him hardening? um
Oh, okay. Let's pivot on that then real quick. That's a good place to pivot on is
okay.
that hardening of the heart. I think of Pharaoh, uh, and Moses tells him to let the people go, and his heart is hardened. He almost doubles down with his convictions, and in that that's one thing to consider, that doubling down on what the familiar, keeping the slaves. Another thing in that article you shared with me from Keith Campbell, he talks about humility at the end there, and you kind of mentioned in our chat some concerns you had about humility. But I kind of read it a different way. He talks about the danger of a religious leader becoming narcissistic, because when there's a leader and someone in a leadership position, they tend to feed off of the energy of the congregation, and if the congregation is okay with having someone rule over them, do their thinking for them, um, if a congregation is going to lift up this person as a cult leader, and that's a very pejorative thing to say, cult leader, but they treat him as a cult leader, they treat him as a mediator between them and the divine, like God almost. That's a lot of psychoepistemological weight to put on a single person, and it's no wonder they fall, it's so often that they fall into pedophilia or they fall into some sort of corruption. Because I think when you're in a leadership position like that, the allure of the crowd, the energy that you get from your congregation, it moves from where you were supposed to be feeding them, like you're a shepherd, to where you are now feeding off of them. Like now you become the wolf in sheep's clothing very, very quickly. Um,
Yes.
I see that, and I also see that. So back to the humility aspect. Um, Pharaoh isn't humble. He has his heart hardened. But same with any of these various local church leaders who become corrupt pedophilia priests or who become completely narcissistic. They're not humble because they've allowed their perceptions to be completely framed by the hype of the crowd, by their congregation, and they've entered into a very improper relationship with them, almost like a god complex,
But I
and
think
that blinds you to the truth.
but I think also that, you have to consider that the leadership, um, that having power and all that stuff is something that narcissists and psychopaths, they want that, so
Mm-hmm.
they look for those leadership positions, and it's really easy for them to cash in on it, especially in the Protestant church,
Oh
because
yeah.
I was telling so they can get that, they can get access to people and have authority and influence with very little effort. They can just, people, all they have to say is like, oh yeah, I believe in that Jesus. I believe in Jesus, and
Yeah, huge. I
um
actually share that critique with Protestantism as well, is that they don't have that. Still the Catholic Church still has problems too, but they don't have that rigor. That this is an idea with Joseph Heinrich, the one who wrote The Weirdest People on Earth. He has this thing called cred. That's those are costly displays of authority. For someone to be an authority figure, they have to attribute. I don't know the word what cred means off the top of my head. I wrote about this today in the quad in my post. I think you commented on it, but someone
credibility enhanced something
enhancing
credibility.
displays. Yes, a costly enhancing displays, right?
Yes.
Someone in a leadership position because they've fasted, because they've sacrificed, they've done the hard work. That gives them cred, and so you know that they've been vetted, and you can follow them or trust them. Maybe not follow them like you follow Jesus, but they've done the work to be a proper representative of the truth. So there's an appropriate relationship there, and you get this with kids. Do this too with their parents, right? On the micro level, kids will push the boundaries, and if the parent can hold their boundaries, and if the kid can see that their parents are actually having cred, meaning they've done the work to provide, they have that degree of respect with their children, they're going to respect them even if they disobey. They're going to respect them. um that's kind of baked into the family unit already, naturally. Now with the church structure, I'm not sure if cred is built into a common Protestant denomination, and maybe that might be the struggle you're having, because
But
the same people that cultivated that brought up a bad narcissist, they're still there, and they hadn't seemed to correct that yet.
and I think you're on to something there because, you know, um, with if you have a cost to being a leader, if you might lose your head because you're a Christian, or Charlie Kirk, if you're you might die, that it's a cost.
Mm-hmm.
And so that, I think that if there's a place that people are being persecuted, then, and maybe that's what happened in the early church, is like people aren't going to want to, have that cred, if that
Mm-hmm.
means, they're not going to want to have that display, if that means that they might lose their life for doing that. So maybe that's why so many people are, it's pretty cheap, to be able to just be a leader in the church in America. There's not a lot of cost, it's a lot of benefits, and there's no cost. So
Hmm.
I think that's a really good point that you said, that is a really a way for things to kind of be sorted if
Mm, yeah. Chris, I see you unmuted yourself.
Yes, I had this is really interesting because this is sort of relevant to something I heard from my mom earlier today. We were out paddleboarding, and she told us about the story of Jesus cursing the fig tree and how she had finally come to understand what it meant, and how the reason he curses this fig trees are supposed to bear fruit, um, like even like before their leaves start coming in. And so this fig tree has all these leaves and whatnot, and so it's like in full bloom. It's like showing off its life force essentially, but it has no fruit to it. And so it's kind of it is in a way almost like this. It makes me think that that particular story is almost God's disdain for religious narcissism, because this thing is all show, it has no fruit to it. It's put forth all this effort to make itself look like it might have fruit, but then it doesn't. He curses it and it shrivels up, because that's how he really feels about people who try to, get up there,
Mm.
make a show for it all, but not really provide anything, not provide any kind of sustenance. It's all just kind of fake, and there's no sustenance to it. So that was my thought I
No,
had to put
that's
in there.
beautiful. That also
Yes.
ties to Adam and Eve with the fig branches. They make
Mm.
themselves coverings. Uh, Even before God was going to have to make them coverings anyways from the animal skins when he cast them out of Eden. But they decide to make their own coverings off of that very same tree, that fig leaf, to cover their nakedness. Really
Um,
good point.
yes, and that's actually the scripture, Matthew 7:15. It talks about, the wolf and sheep's clothing is right before that, but then it talks about the fruit, and you will know them by their fruit. And if you look at the NLT, it's like you'll know them by their actions.
Hmm.
So so that is exactly the truth. And the other thing I looked up today was 1 Timothy 5:22. And it says, don't be hasty to appoint a church leader. So basically is what that one says. And so don't lay hands on somebody. Um, don't do it real quick. So I feel like that, we have to do our homework and understand that. But there's still that element of, you know, that, like, with the early church leaders, that some of them were, I mean, they had to have this low fear. They had to have, I think Timothy had, he was probably neurotic and
Hmm.
and fearful. And there, and I think it was Paul that told him, go ahead and drink some wine because you're sick all the time, and things like that. So um and it seemed like he was kind of like trying to talk him up to stand up to other people, with, even though he was young or whatever. I don't remember that. I didn't look that scripture up, but um so he wasn't like a natural born
Mm.
leader. Or which, what is a natural born leader? Does that mean somebody that's got, they got this thing where, and I think about Moses too, where he didn't have a problem. Women are a lot different than men. I mean, you know, we're we're not really good leaders because we're like out to be mothers and
Hmm.
protect and all that stuff. And so Moses, like, he grinds up this poison, this golden calf, and makes people drink it. And because they had, sinned, but he was like, well, it's better for me to do this than it would be for, God to hammer you guys. So
Yeah,
here,
leaders
drink.
can make hard decisions like that.
Yeah, and
Uh,
as a woman, it would be really hard for me to say, okay, drink this poison, it's going to make you really sick, so, because
yeah.
you're really not designed for that, but yeah, so, I don't know, I probably was on a
No,
rabbit trail.
there's you're pulling out a lot of interesting things there. Um, Hard times create strong men and men, good leaders. And it's sad because we tend to give great rewards to leaders, wartime leaders specifically, because that's their moment to shine. That's when you need Winston Churchill. He may have had a savior complex. Oh no, he absolutely did have one. He was a great wartime leader. They kind of kicked him out after the war, though, because they're like,
Yeah,
"You're a great wartime leader, but you're not
yeah,
really a great peacetime leader. Get out
yes,
of here
right,
too."
right.
It's kind of very funny how that works. Uh, but we do like to learn lessons the hard way too often, and we need to have a leader with, a populist leader who can do the hard work, who can you know, be the bulldog. However, I don't know if that's always the best. I don't know if that needs to be the prerequisite for church leadership. Uh, Hear me out on this, because the church got started, and that was the cultural climate. But how do we live the gospel in a time of peace? We get complacent, we get soft, then that allows bad actors to slither in, because no one wants to take up the mantle of leadership. No one wants to make the hard decisions to make people eat gold. In Moses' situation, even in times of peace, you have to make difficult decisions. I think of it like this. So Jordan Peterson talks about leadership. One of he talks about organizations and companies, and often the best leaders, you don't even know they're there because they're busy taking care of the bunch of little issues in the company. They're tending to the little things that get overlooked. And because they manage things so well, you don't even realize that they're great leaders because no catastrophe happens in your organization. As opposed to an organization that a catastrophe, things start to fall apart. And then you got you know, um, the rough psychopathic CEOs that come in and make cuts and everything. They're great and they're glorified as great leaders. Well, they're only great leaders because they hopped into a really bad situation. What about the companies that can kind of keep stuff together and have long sustainable growth? You don't praise them as leaders. They don't get the public accolade so much. So, with Christians, I think there's a paradigm here we're looking at where we want, it's almost like followers of Christ are hardwired for charismatic leaders who can speak truth to power, right? And who can kind of fill that strong man persona, and who can teach in a way that's, gets me riled up, gets me going. Oh, this is something cool I learned about in the book called The Power of Bad by Baumeister in his course. They talk about religions in early America, how it wasn't the stable religions like Catholicism and Lutheranism that necessarily did well in America, where they had schools of divinity and they were a stable structure, and to be a teacher, you had to actually understand the gospel from a more intellectual theological perspective. Rather, it was the churches that had these revivalist people sermons who were preaching hellfire and brimstone, telling the people to whoop their ass into shape, or God's going to beat you with a stick. And people, and they track this with the data. People would like leave their local towns and travel miles to go listen to a charismatic preacher who could teach with such charisma about how they need to avoid hell and not get burned. They didn't want to pay attention to the peaceful Christian theologian who's amazed with the mysteries of God, that's worshiping God in a more peaceful manner. It's almost like humans are hardwired for bad. So there's a little bit of psychology there. Humans are hardwired for the bad. We need that. Fast forward to today, we live in a relatively peaceful climate. And maybe our leadership, what we should be pulling for leadership in a given church and given in our institutions, is not the guy who can beat down the snakes because we're in a wartime, because that's only going to attract the narcissists, right? The bad types of narcissists. I think the good, you know, what we need are competent leaders, but too often, no one wants to rise to that mantle because it may not be rewarded in that culture. It may not be rewarded in that church. And so I'm placing the moral blame here on the members, on the congregation for being too passive, for um, not taking the mantle of initiative when they ought to, expecting, um, wired for a leader, a strongman leader to come in and tell them what to do, as opposed to realizing we're in a time of peace. Maybe we ought to rise up and, um, take the reins a little bit. What do you make of that? I know that was kind of a um, messy set of ideas I laid out on the table here, but I think we're both feeling towards something here about how
I
we work.
well,
Yeah.
I think that you and I both we agreed that I'm not sure. Dr. Campbell had said something in the article that you know that we kind of need to that it was put back on the leaders to do the right thing or whatever, and I just don't see that happening. So I think that what you're saying, what we're both trying to grapple with, how do we go forward, and what do we do individually? And go ahead.
Yes. No, it just came to me. So, in Exodus, right? They were talking. I was learning about this juridical system. Hear me out on this form of governance. You need, when you legislate and you make rules, in order for those rules to be applied, you need a very muscular executive to enforce those rules. Now, so that means you need a strong man, a king, to lay the hammer down and enforce the rules. And the more rules you have, the more laws you have, the more legislation, the muscular the law needs to be coupled with a powerful executive branch. Now, what Moses is laying out is not that in uh, in the book of Exodus. He's laying out a juridical system, a wisdom-based system, where he has this whole rule of 10, right? And you talk to the person of that 10, and you have a little type of fellowship, small group, and that small group reports to a group of elders, and there's 50 there, and it kind of scales up. That way, Moses isn't getting exhausted all the time. Now, I think what happens later in the Bible is they make a mistake, is they want a king. And not just any king, they want a king who will go out and come back again. A king who is that strongman model, a wartime leader. They want to go to war and gain more resources. And they want that muscular executive to execute things.
Yes.
And that's the danger of having a king. They would prefer the wartime strongman tribal leader as opposed to the previous model with that Jethro suggested that seemed to work, this juridical system where you don't need, in a juridical system of governance, you don't need you don't need a bunch of abstract rules per se. You don't need a bunch of complicated legalities and the accompanying executive police force to enforce it. In a juridical system, it's wisdom based. You have small councils working out their disagreements, taking responsibility, communicating with each other. It's a subsidiary hierarchy, as Peterson talks about in his paper with Jonathan Peugeot about subsidiary hierarchies. Individuals are taking initiative and taking the reins of accountability in their own local families, local communities, and not relying on a king to do the work for them. But the moment Israel chooses a king, that type of strongman king, they start getting in. They start on the path of dictatorship, of totalitarianism. They move away from that form of governance. Some thoughts there. So I think maybe to answer the problem with your church, maybe the problem with Protestantism, perhaps, um, Protestantism is trying to get away from the centralized authority of the Catholic Church, right? They're protesting against the bad things. The problem with Protestants is they want their cake, they want to have their cake and eat it too. They want to get away from the centralized authority who's interpreting scriptures in a certain way and telling them how to do the sacraments. They want to move away from that. But they're throwing out the responsibility with the holy water of the Catholic Church. They're throwing out everything a priest ought to do. Because now they want to have this universal priesthood, this universal invisible priesthood thing amongst all and they don't want to have their nicely dressed priest who wears a suit and tosses the incense around like they do in the Catholic Church. Everyone's a priest in the Protestant church, right? Well, that means everyone ought to act like a priest and do the hard work that a priest has to do, which is intercession, atoning for the sins of your community, taking upon yourself responsibility. And I don't really see that reflected in many non-denominational Protestant Christianity. They
No,
want their
I
cake.
think there's a
Yeah,
big problem.
yeah.
I think
Okay.
there's more of a problem in the Protestant church with their, I mean, they've let go of so many things that we really need. You know, we need a way to use our body to worship the Lord. I probably say worship really weird. My sister always gives me a hard time about that, but um, but we need that because you know, we don't have it. Even like the rituals and the, you know, knowing what is going to be taught. And I don't think that it's really good for one man to have to in the Protestant church to have a pastor that has to come up with a sermon every week. And you know, I don't really think that that's the way that it was in the temple. You know, Jesus, I think they would get up and have scripture readings and stuff like that. And that's what the Catholic Church does. I mean, they do, you know, the cycle of scripture
Yeah.
and stuff, and
The
do the
emphasis
different.
Well, the emphasis in high church liturgy is, as opposed to the low church Protestants, is their focus is the ritual. It's the worship part. It's how they're using their body to participate in the divine mysteries. Protestants have a propositional form of worship where they do a little bit of singing and dancing in some denominational churches, which is not a bad thing, but it's much more sentimental, in my opinion. There's a book called it's a really good book that tracks. Never mind, I won't go on that tangent. But their worship is more what they view as church participation is hearing someone deliver a sermon, and so the focus becomes
Yeah,
on the sermon, as opposed to the Orthodox and Catholics. They have a priest, but he's kind of backgrounded. The foreground is the Eucharist. The foreground is, or the main thing is the sacrament. And the priest is merely a vehicle to kind of bring that about. And so there's a difference there between, I really think Protestants are, who when they desacramentize their culture, desacramentize their religious worship, they're losing something critical.
absolutely.
Because when Ayn Rand talks a lot about this in her book, substituting an ideal for a man. Catholics and Orthodox churches have an ideal that's not attached to necessarily a single man, a charismatic leader.
Right,
They
right.
are more participating in the ideal, the logos of Christ. Protestants are in danger of substituting a man for an ideal through their
Yeah,
pastor,
and
having to
I
come
think
up with
that
some charismatic
that's
sermon every Sunday.
yes, and that's why there's you know, there's a bigger problem in the Protestant church. I believe that is nailing it there with it. And there was something that I was thinking when you were talking. I should have wrote it down, but it'll come back to me. I'll think of it.
So
Can.
we kind of laid out the why narcissists tend to be selected in Protestant circles into leadership positions. This kind of how we frame the ecology, the
Yes.
setup. it just draws. And maybe if America got hit with a devastating war, where your life would be on the line, if you preached a true sermon, the Stasi would cut your head off. The narcissist would flee. Narcissists aren't gonna,
No, they're
and
not.
you're gonna select for actual authentic Christians. But maybe we don't really. But do we really want to have that type of situation in our country? Um,
No,
do we want?
no.
We don't want that situation. And so I
No.
think the impetus on for Christians is to learn how to properly elevate, celebrate, cultivate virtues that will sustain peace and prosperity. Not the prosperity gospel, but you know what I mean. The peace on earth without having to get humbled by God with a war or a famine or an economic collapse where that will kind of clear out the temple of the narcissist. We want to be able, as Christians, to be able to cultivate a church that can select authentic Christians in seats of decision making, in the seats of leadership. How then do we do that as Protestants? Like, how would you do that? How just hypothetically? I know you're probably not in a position of church leadership, but how, looking at what we've lost from what Protestants have lost from the Catholic Church and that structure, and how we want our cake but we can't eat, and we want to eat it too. How would we repent? How would we, create something that would actually be worthy of heaven's participation, that
But
wouldn't pull for narcissists?
I see, like, the way that the Catholic Church is set up. They support these positions of where people do things that secularly, it's that if somebody, they have to get a grant for, say, like an art, um a grant for an art exhibit or something, where they're getting a grant. But it shouldn't be in the secular thing, because that's when you get in with all this weird ideology stuff.
Mm-hmm.
So I see that they have that. But I think that with the Protestant church, it's like it's like McDonald's or something, eating. It's just like fast food, consumerism. And so I think that, just having a different focus would be something. But because the advantage of the Catholic Church is, it's a worldwide organization. And the Catholic or the Protestant Church, there's so many different splinters of Protestantism, and so many, it's not organized. And and if you get a church that it's a big mega church, then that's where you see the narcissism and the psychopaths. And it's strange the way that it just attracts. But it's a consumerism, I think, is the problem. We're consumerist. And they want, people want to, they want to show, they want a
Mm.
the whole, they want to have, be
They want
entertained.
their gladiators. They
Yeah,
want the gladiators fighting. You're not entertained.
yeah, it's true. uh, um so it's a huge problem that it's going to take prayer and things. And I do think that the it's an exchange, I think, with the back when the Reformation happened, that they there was a uh probably, narcissist or whatever were in the Catholic Church, and they were doing things for themselves.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's, and I don't think it's a horrible thing that there's different churches. I know people talk about Christianity, but it is horrible for Protestants to not have any kind of organization or anything like that. And like with the Catholic Church, my sister's Catholic now, and I was reading some of the literature that was being put out by the Catholic Church with the vaccines and especially the COVID vaccine, and they ended up, there's a lot of abortion cell technology that they called out on this stuff, and but they didn't stick with it. They did say, well, in dire circumstances, we're going to back off on that. But at least they were considering it, and
Mhm.
they had the information, and you didn't see anything like that with the Protestant church because they're so they're so fragmented.
Yeah. Do you think back to your point on consumerism in the gospel, and they want to be entertained. They go to church expecting entertainment. Consumerism is very, very superficial. It doesn't challenge you. It's not consuming Christianity is not the same thing as participating in Christianity. Um, Very different. Consuming is a very passive. Epistemologically, it's a very passive action. You just kind of take in the sermon. You take in information. You take in the faith.
Right, right.
Yeah, and I think that what the virtues that are cultivated from a consumeristic culture is not much intellectual depth, not much epistemological depth with the mysteries of God. You lack the spiritual rootedness versus a participatory form of religion where it's not about consuming the gospel but participating in it. This is why the Catholic Church has the mysteries of God, the sacraments. They're called mysteries. I mentioned this to Juan in the bonus video we did with them, where mysteries are not things that you don't learn a mystery by reading a crime solving by opening the scriptures and cracking the biblical code. That's not mystery. Now, crime fighting literature, sorry, crime mystery novels have psyop that word mystery to mean something like that, where you do deduction and you can logically solve the puzzle, and if you just get all the pieces of the puzzle together, you solve the mystery. Mystery has a really deep ancient root word, which means initiation, ordinances, participation. You know something through participating in it. You know, the sacrament. You know Jesus Christ through the sacrament by participating in the sacraments. Just like your marriage, you know your spouse, and your spouse is a mystery, not because they're confusing, but because you can only know them by participating with them. And so your relationship with your Christian faith, with your spouse, is not one of consumption. You don't eat your husband. You don't eat God necessarily. You participate with God. It's a participatory aspect. And those, I think, who can kind of latch on to this participatory aspect of the gospel of Jesus Christ, they will have much more deep spiritual rootedness. They'll have much more discernment. They'll be more grounded, as opposed to the consumer culture. Now, the problem with Protestantism is they want to be popular to get more people to come to their churches. And how do you become a popular church, a big mega church? Well, you placate to people's consumeristic tendencies. You don't demand anything of them. Marriage is demanding. It will beat you. It will just completely break you at times. I mean, kids in the NICU, like holy crap. Uh, that is not a consumptive, easy. That's not entertaining at all.
Right.
And I fear too often our Christian faith is like that. It's consumeristic. And so I think that we ought to have a Christian faith that actually, Protestants ought to have a Christian faith that actually demands something of them.
Yes.
My opinion. And if Protestants can't figure that out, they're just going to dwindle. And I think this is why so many young men particularly are flocking to the Orthodox Church right now and the Catholic Church. It's because they actually demand something of you.
Yes, and
Yeah.
gee, that's not the way. I mean, and the whole thing about like having the right answer, is really bizarre at the Protestant church. It's like, it's not really about having a relationship. It's like you're judged on whether or not you know Christ if you have all the right answers, and they teach you the right answers, but they don't really teach you to critically think like Jesus did. I mean, he didn't just say, okay, you know, here's how this is the right answer. He really developed people's character and critically thinking. And I mean, he didn't just do it, oh well, let's just do this by words that we're just going to be these word what was the wordsmiths that that's how you become a Christian. But that's not really true. It's not anything that's taught in scripture. That it's always about obedience and having actions that say that this is how you believe. I mean, I think that's why we're on this earth, is to live it out, to live our faith
Mhm.
out, to and so if we go in there and we sit in the pew and we come because they said there. We actually had a church in Marion that where I'm from, that had a they were giving away TVs to get people to,
Mm.
it's like what, so just weird stuff.
It's almost bad as state subsidies on the
That was like maybe 10
higher
years ago,
vote.
but it just stuck with me. I'm like, what? It's kind of like those it's almost like the timeshare things,
Yeah,
It's like, what? Here, bite on this. This, come to our church and give us your money, and we'll give you a TV. Or
yeah.
just bizarre things like so. And that's probably another thing that is different, that what but whenever there's money there, it's like shark chum. Yes, for the
Mhm.
narcissists. And anytime there's a way to cash in on that. But it seems like there's uh more ways to that the Catholic Church has offset the distribution of funds. And
Mhm.
and I really like the different things that you see there, and with the different things they support.
Yeah.
Whereas with when you're looking at the Protestant church, they support they support missionaries and ministry and stuff like that, but often. But to like just do the hard work of um you know I don't know. You don't want to just give people um people take advantage when when they have like money that they can get a hold of for what's the fund called, where they you give it to people that are down and out and stuff. But in my experience, a lot of times it's somebody that's you know doing drugs or something, and they don't have money, and then when they get it, then it's really bad for them.
Mhm.
So I've done a lot of I don't know if you want to call it ministry, but I've done work with people that have had problems with drug addictions and things like that. So,
Mhm.
and I know of a church that they had things set in place, and then they didn't follow those rules, which were things like if we're not going to give you a benevolence fund. That's what it is. We're not going to give you a benevolence fund unless you're coming to church and things like that.
Mhm.
Well, they gave this woman $500 and she was dead the next week. She overdosed
Mm.
on probably, I think it was heroin. And it's like, hello. Our town had a lot of problems with drugs and stuff. So I did try to get involved and, do
But
um art workshops and things like that,
yeah.
Bible studies and things. I tried to, do small groups and stuff. I did a couple murals too with
Mhm.
so I have an experience with that, experiences of knowing that this is how things go. And, I don't see that happening with the Catholic Church as much, where there's
Yeah.
not things set in place to offset um, those kind of situations coming up.
Mm. Yeah, the Catholic there are trade-offs between, traditional Catholic Orthodox, even you can maybe put Lutheran in there. Lutheran's more high church, as opposed to the fractious nature of Protestantism. There's trade-off between both. I spent a lot of time kind of praising the Catholic Church in this episode, or in this DiaLogos, um, and being more harsh on Protestants because, we're being critical of Protestants right now. That's kind of the purpose of this DiaLogos. Uh, I do think though,
Real
one
quick,
of the trade-offs.
I just want to say I'm gonna head out here.
All
So
right, see ya, Chris.
it was a pleasure
Thanks.
listening. So glad I was able to say a
Yeah,
couple things
Nice
here
to
and there.
meet you.
Yep.
See ya.
Take care.
see ya. I think a major trade-off. This has to do with any institution that gets too big, too clunky. You corrupt the top, or you corrupt one node that all the other nodes are connected to, and you corrupt the whole. Kind of the situation. If the top leader, if the king, if the pope is off, then the whole structure is
Yes,
prone to
that
corruption.
is true. That is
Yeah,
true.
Protestants don't have that issue.
No.
They instead have to deal with the issue on a local level, and so it's distributed. Very American in that regards, by the way, because America, how it was originally designed, is the federal government small and more power to the states. So if one state does something right, other states can look at it and say, we're going to do that too. But now we're all just kind of becoming a conglomeration of a federation. And so the Fed gets more power, and now the states are losing their individual sovereignty. Originally, if one state goes bad, it's not going to corrupt the whole. Uh, and we still kind of hold that. That's where we're the United States of America. We're not just America. We do have individual statehood baked into it. I know every state kind of had an original constitution. Each state was separated for that reason. Uh, so the church kind of reflects that with Protestantism, is there's a million different Protestant sects, and their problem isn't centralized corruption, top-down corruption, unless they become a centralized institution with a bunch of Protestants buying into one major giant megachurch that I'm not aware of. I don't think they have that. But their problem is what the problem that Protestants have to bear up is taking personal responsibility, and they can't rely on a centralized authority to do it for them. Because what the Catholic Church does with that nice big church structure is it solves a lot of the problems that come up in church politics. A lot of the issues have already been answered. There's been a precedent set in the Catholic Church. There's wisdom in that tradition. Protestants, because they've thrown that away, they have to figure a lot of that up from the bottom up, and they're learning in real time, especially the non-denominational churches, trying to start up these churches and realizing they just come and go because they have no spiritual depth. They have no rootedness. See, the Catholic Church has a lot of spiritual rootedness because they have things like the sacraments. They have an authoritative structure of priests that can teach one another. They have these ordinances, these embodied forms of participating that have been handed down from the original apostles. Protestants don't have that. It's almost like they don't care to have that. It's not the big deal for them, and they're throwing that out to their own peril because now they're not spiritually rooted. Their roots don't go deep, so they're very shallow. or they're in danger of becoming very shallow. I think the responsibility for Protestants is to learn how to sink their roots in deep, to learn how to have wisdom and discernment and all those things. And that is, and I'm with you, Leah, because I'm not an Orthodox Christian, even though I have Orthodox icons on my wall left and right. I'm not a Catholic, but I feel I'm struggling because I don't really have a spiritual home, and I'm feeling the absolute spiritual existential weight of that. Like, oh man, I'm homeless. How do I figure this out? Because you kind of mentioned too, you're jumping between churches here. Like, how do we figure that out if we are going to maintain our identity as Protestants or as non-Catholics, non-Orthodox Christians? How do we figure that out in our community?
Yeah, it's a tough one, and it is like a the way it's set up now, it is a really it's a feeding area for narcissism and for I mean the structure is just prime pickings for,
Yeah. See,
so problem.
I think the way you counter it is having, and this is where I think Campbell is right, Keith Campbell, with this idea of communal small groups, like what we're doing right now. We're having a DiaLogos, and we're actually asking hard questions of one another. And we don't have a single pastor who's saying, think this way, think this way. Rather, we're actually wrestling with this. See, I've gone into non-denominational Christian churches, and there wasn't a culture of even asking questions in small groups that we're doing right now. It was very, very dogmatic. Scripture this, scripture that, don't question it. And I struggle with that because it doesn't actually cultivate spiritual and intellectual depth. In this book, the language, you might like this. This is called The Language of Fanaticism, Cultish, by Amanda Montell. And what she does is she goes and visits, researches, and then visits various cults, both extreme cults, but also like more silly cults like CrossFit and the bike cycling cult, because those are cults. And she talks about the online cult of Joe Dispenza and a bunch of these self-help gurus on the internet. And she does talk about Christian cults as well, Christianese. And she
What
has this concept of Christianese language. The book's called The Language of Fanaticism, how cult leaders use language to manipulate belief systems.
what I
And,
was gonna ask you is
uh,
what would you say is a cult? I mean, what is the characteristics does she say or whatever that's would would
so
identify a cult over, a church that's just got
a
some
church, I
bad
think a
leader?
major one, which I agree with, she has this concept called thought-terminating cliches, where thought-terminating cliches. Cults are about control. And so the cult leader will use language. These are called thought-terminating cliches. It's like a slogan in political jargon, where if you ask a question, it is what it is. That would be a thought-terminating cliche. Don't ask me that question. Stop thinking about it. Boys will be boys. That's another cliche. And she talks about how cult leaders will not actually communicate a bunch of ideas that actually edify and expand the mind of the congregants and the people in their cult, but rather they will use language to just pull the party line, to regurgitate Christianese, Christian slogans. Jesus died, and they repeat that over and over again. But they don't actually ask the question, well, why did Jesus die? What does that mean? What does that mean for me? They don't ask the deeper questions. It's very superficial, and you're not supposed to push the. They just give you short answers all the time. That would be that's a thought terminating cliche culture, and Christianese tends to be filled with that. And
Yes.
maybe there's just take this on faith, just believe this and it will make sense. Like, pray the prayers in the Catholic Church, and then the Theotokos will make sense, or the mystery of the resurrection, as you say these prayers. Maybe there's some validity to that, but in the language of cults, that is one of the components, is they don't have a culture that cultivates deep deep inquiry and understanding. They don't they don't cultivate your free volitional thought of grasping what is actually being said. So when I was exploring non-denominational Christian churches way back when, I struggled with this because I would ask questions because I'm curious, I want to know, and I got the same don't think about it, think deeply, just accept it, just accept it. Here is the primary answer. I think this is where I think Keith Campbell is right. Is if you can have a church that has small groups within it, like you and I, we're having a DiaLogos right now, and we're asking hard questions. If you can recreate that in your church, where you actually are raw and honest about your concerns, and you're actually going to listen to someone who may be criticizing a certain policy in your church or a certain theological problem that you're dealing with, actually consider it and not just give them a blanket statement to just stuff down their questions, but actually try and develop a mutual understanding. I think that does. I think that actually empowers the individual members of your church, of your congregation, because now you have people thinking for themselves, actually not just accepting a thought-terminating cliche as an answer, but actually grasping, having spiritual depth in their comprehension of the reality of the gospel. And I think that can only occur through interpersonal relationships. I think that's the lifeblood of a church that is an actual church, actually the bridegroom of Christ, and not just a cult.
Yes.
So that would go back to what we talked about earlier about the juridical system of governance that Jethro suggested to Moses with the whole groups of 10. And actually, I think a council of 10 people actually, 10 people. You talked about this on the quad with me about this whole tribal wiring we have in the brain.
Mhm.
We are wired for small scale communities. We're wired for a tribe.
Yes.
I think that's critical. Like, I don't think you can live the gospel with people beyond that small little network. I think if you
And,
try and offload that to someone else, it's going to fail.
and if you think about it, I mean, yes, Jesus did, he did large speaking engagements, but he really had a relationship with 12 disciples,
Yeah,
he's God, and that's how he did
yeah,
it, so
hmm
that is very accurate. I think what you're saying is like, it's, that's the way we physically are designed. We're not designed to have, this mass media, we don't even on, even on the quad, there's like a limited number of people that have, that I really, I can't read everybody's stuff and have a relationship with everybody, you know, that's even just, and there's not that many people that come up, that are saying things, but I probably have, I did, you know, make, follow quite a few people, but
hmm
realistically, I'm not really following them, It's like,
hmm
so
Well, you only have so much bandwidth.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah,
And even Jesus, he didn't try to disciple 70 people. Although he had 70 people that he sent out, but I mean, close people that, were with him, and, during the time that he was walking the earth and his ministry started, there was 12,
hmm
you know?
hmm and then they had, and then I think those 12 had small knit relationships. I know John, the John the Beloved, or the Revelator, he had this whole Johannian school, and that was tightly knit in early Christianity. And so I think if you're gonna if there are narcissistic leaders in your church congregation, I think one of the litmus tests that you can hold yourself to as a people to ask yourself why is, well, how well do I know my fellow believer? do I just have a parasocial relationship with the church leader, or do I actually know brother and sister so and so, and we actually meet and are integral people in each other's life? Hannah Arnett, she wrote the book called The Origins of Totalitarianism, and she talks about how totalitarian regimes can overtake the masses, and she talks about the atomization of the individual. When the individual doesn't have these interpersonal relationships where they are actually they're knitted in a little village with family in their local institutions like marriage and work, when that gets fractionated in a culture, that culture is ready. The people in that culture, because they've had those social bonds eroded, are ready. They are primed to be taken to be psyoped by a regime leader like Stalin, Lenin, or Hitler. And so the solution is to strengthen those good tribal connections with your family networks. And so I think, like I've said, if you're experiencing narcissist leaders constantly rotating through different churches, I think one way you can look at it is how closely am I knitted to the people in this community. And also, with that being said, being knitted to the people in your community, your narcissistic church leader or anyone in a leadership position, they can't really have a participatory, challenging relationship with you. They aren't going to challenge you the same way your husband will challenge you and call out your bullshit on something, or the way your small group, like we're in a DiaLogos and we're calling out, we're wrestling with each other with these ideas. You aren't, no leader can give that to you. That's not fair to expect that. Where you get that from, where you get the deep participatory aspect in the faith and not the mere consumptory aspect with the faith, is in the small groups, is back and forth with real people who will push against you and say, no, you're wrong. Yes, I think this way, you think that way. We are two individuals who respect each other, who are clashing and butting our heads together. That is where depth is formed. And when you have people who form that depth, and enough community has cultivated that keeps narcissistic leaders at bay. They don't get away with crap because the congregation are actually free thinking individuals.
Yes.
Yes. Yeah, thank you for hearing me out. I'm wrestling with these same issues you are in my own Christian
Yes.
circles.
And
So
I think sometimes
yeah.
People are verbal processors. It sounds
Yeah.
like you are. And I probably am a little bit too.
Yeah.
But like back to what you were saying, and the reason why I wrote it down real quick, but the regular people thing, that that's something that I also wanted to talk about, was that these different and you kind of touched on it, where people get into leadership, and then they get a big head, and and then, but also the other thing is that people want to take them down too if they get but like the regular people, I don't know if you've, well, I couldn't even read it because I try to stay away from stuff that, but I got the book Nazi Doctors, and then I couldn't read it. But these are, there's people that they have that it's like regular people were doing these horrible things, and on board with these horrible things that were being done to others.
Ordinary men, yeah. Uh-huh.
And so it's what you were saying that just struck me as like, we have like, I don't know, I suppose I need to read about Carl Jung, because I don't know what this integration thing is. But it seems to me that like with the people that were like the priest, and they were the line of Aaron, and Aaron, it had to be a hereditary thing. And if you think about it, the things that they had to do were very OCD. So this OCD trait. Like no other tribe. It was the people that came from Aaron were the
Yeah.
ones that had to had this place as a priest, so that they could they could fulfill these obligations. And it was a gift to have OCD. If I was, I probably got zapped, and Josh and I talked about that a little bit at the end of our talk. But it's also, I see these different things, like, you know, that we have studied with those two classes that we took to prepare for this, that but there's gifts in having low fear, and some of the narcissistic traits, or even the psychopathic traits, if it's not um if it's if a psychopath could possibly lead the church pretty well in times of you know duress, if they gave it. I think if they could use their gifts. It's a gift not to.
Okay. So are you asking how do we integrate these different personalities in a body of believers? The
Yeah,
psychopaths,
and
the
also, do
OCDs,
you
the
think there's
compassionates.
value in having these different traits? And as a the different. I don't know if it the body of Christ, if it talks about the different places that people have, and not everybody's supposed to be um a pastor, and I don't know. What are some of the other things that it seems to me that Joseph possibly had autism. I mean, he was very blunt, and he's like, here, he's just very honest, and it didn't go well. He wasn't really understood. Um, so I don't know. I just see these different things, and I don't know if that has anything to do with what Carl Jung teaches, because I haven't read his.
So I think Carl Jung, I haven't read him at length. I think the way you integrate the shadow, you integrate the dark parts of your psyche, is, I think, first one, you have to recognize it. Yoda says to name must your fear be, before banish it you can. You have to recognize those aspects of your psyche. And you almost have to have like a dialogue with those aspects of your psyche to be able to converse with it. Um, you have to know what it is and converse with it and put it in its proper place. Whether that be, I'm casting this out, exercising you like an evil demon, or you are
Yeah.
or you are saying you don't belong as the governing principle of my life, but you are useful. My aggression, I have a problem with my temper. My temper, you temper are useful in this situation when I need to defend my family, right? And so you know how to put it in its proper place. That's actually putting things in their proper place is the logos. Logos. That's the word of God. Where we all have the logos within us, I believe, that we can put those parts of our psyche in their proper place with God's intelligibility, which also means light too, by the way. Those logos and light are put together. You shine a light on the dark parts of your psyche, and you're able to, with the logos, put it in its proper place. That's
I,
the individual. I think that applies too with the body of believers, is it requires the logos, that spirit of light, and putting things in their proper place. I think what is necessary for that to occur is people who can actually have freedom of speech, being able to talk through it, understand it, communicate it. The moment people stop talking and don't think about these issues and don't think about the problems, the logos isn't there to put it in its proper place. That's what I think. I think it's the same principle, both on the individual and on the community. So that'd be my best answer to bring some Jungian ideas into this.
yes, yes.
Not sure if that helps. So yeah,
Do it.
probably
Go ahead.
we're running yeah. That's probably a good place to kind of wrap up on. It's getting a little late for me. I got to eat dinner here.
Sounds
How
great.
did you feel? Yeah. were we able to kind of address the issues you've been wrestling with? Did you feel like it gave you more perspective on it and
I
more
did.
food for thought in
I
your own
did.
study?
I
Okay.
think that it was, I hadn't really, we both verbally processed with the Protestant church and um, the Catholic church, and the different pitfalls that not having the structure in place kind of like gives opportunity to some bad stuff. And I think we did really good. I think it was
Yeah,
good. I Going
you
forward.
definitely you afforded me some space too to really because this was your proposal, but some things that you said sparked some issues I've been wrestling with, and you did a good job at affording me space to verbally articulate my struggle with those. So I appreciate
Yeah,
that. Thank you.
yeah. Well, um, it did kind of clarify things. I think going forward, I do think it's our responsibility to really not lay hands immediately on who you're going to be following, or who's your leader. You just um, I don't think that I had a concept of uh, what that was about before, when I was younger. And and I started going to these churches, this church. And so, going forward, I know that that's a problem. And I did choose a Protestant church and not the Catholic church. But um, just knowing that it's my responsibility, to follow Christ, and I don't need to follow somebody else following Christ. I need to follow Christ.
Yeah, it's hard. Easier said than done. All right. Well, thank you, Leah. I'm gonna hit stop on the record here. Yeah.